Hello everyone, in this video I'm going to show you how to cut the corner halving joint. Very simple at first glance, but there are a few things that could make it a bit difficult for you. So in this video I'm going to show you how I go about it and how I go about preventing those problems from happening. So, let's go. Right, intros aside, I can't wait to do some actual work. So let's get in close and see what tools we need to start with. So things you need to cut this joint: chisel, a knife, a pen or pencil, preferably with Jesus on it, a ruler, a square, cross-cut saw, and some sort of rip saw. So first thing, let's get marking this out. So obviously these bits are joining together like this. So firstly, we need to establish this shoulder line here. Now what some people are going to do, sorry I forgot to mention the marking gauge in the intro to the video, is they're going to mark the width on here, and then they're going to reference off the end grain and score across like that. And then that will give you your shoulder line to work to. Now this is all right if you're able to get that end grain perfectly square. If it is ever so slightly off, that means your components are going to join like that or like that, depending on how out of square your end grain is, because obviously this is just going to reference off the end. So if you're struggling to get end grain square, firstly watch my 1 Minute Wednesdays video on creating a rudimentary shooting board out of limited materials. But this is the reason you should be marking your shoulder lines with a square. So before I do anything, we're going to mark the face sides and face edges on these. So people do these differently. Some people do the face sides on the inside, some people do the face sides on the outside. I like to do it on the outside of the joint because the face side and the face edge is what my face is going to see. Some sort of logic like that. So mark that on with a pen or pencil. I just like to use my Jesus pen because it makes me happy. And what's important about these is every time we use the square, we want to be referencing off either our face side or our face edge using the stock on this. As soon as we reference off a different face, that's where it can start throwing things a little bit out. These are your reference faces, so do not get rid of those marks until you have cut the joint. So we're going to joint the ash on top of the sapele like this. So we're going to get our square, reference it off the face edge. And this up and down location doesn't matter too much at this point. I'm only focusing on getting this flush on the end here. So there we go, that feels good. Again, if this end grain is slightly out, you want to be leaving that overhanging a tiny bit so then we can flush it off at the end. Because this is deadly accurate from our beautiful panel saw next door, it doesn't really matter. So I'm going to get that flush. And there we go. Now what you don't want to be doing here is removing the square and tracing around the wood with a knife. Firstly, the knife has the potential to dig into the wood and it's going to give you a wavy line, not great. And secondly, that's offsetted the line to the material that we want to keep here. It's not too important with a corner halving joint like this, but when we start doing them where they're joining in the middle like this, it's really important that we offset the knife line to the inside of this component here, and that will give us a much tighter fit. So anyway, back to where I was going. So square that up on the end grain, and there we go, that's all good. So we're going to mark this off like that. So score lightly to start with, and then start digging in. There we go. We have got a nice crisp line there to work to. Now, that is obviously our waist. What some people might do now is they'll start marking this component onto this one, and then square it across the top like that. But obviously with a shoulder line across here and a shoulder line across the top, that's not going to join because we need to flip over this component here. But then if you look, the face edge is on the inside and the face side is underneath. We don't want to be doing that, so keep track of what you've got here. That's the waist. That means this bit here is the waist. So there we go, right. So face side is out. Let's get this squared across now. So I'm using the square against the face side, getting it flush on the ends here, and then get the knife, light score. Get it digging in. There we go. So now, that will join on there like that. Remove that material, this cross here, remove that. Sorry, it goes that way around. So then face side out, face side out. Voila. So now we've got a mark round here how far we want to lap them over one another. So we're going to use a marking gauge for this. And firstly, I'm going to measure the width of the material, the thickness of the material, and it's about 26 mil. So on this marking gauge, I've got small graduations that I can register that to, and I'm going to make this 13 mil. So this is now set to 13 millimeters, half the thickness of this material here. Sorry, the panel saw is running next door now. I hope this isn't too noisy. And again, to mark this width here, reference off the face side. And this is incredibly important for this because if I've set this slightly wrong, it doesn't matter because the wrong measurement will cancel itself out. If I reference this one off the face side and then this one off not the face side, it will mean that these components possibly sit proud of each other either way like this. So really important that you reference off the face sides on this. And now we've got that shoulder line there, I can see roughly where to stop with this marking gauge. So all the way around, light scores to start with, along the end grain. You really want to be accurate with this, because if you mess out the marking out stage at the start, what's the point in trying to work accurately afterwards? You need to get your marking accurate. It is probably the most important stage of all this. So there we go, that line is scored all the way around, referencing off my face side here. So again, keep on track of this. Look, I've got the cross in there to mark my waist, and that is on the same side as my face side here. I've marked all the way around. That crosses the waist side, but my face edge is on the underside here. Do not let that cross fool you. You are referencing off this, really important. So we now have our lines around the edges that we need to work to. The final ones we've got to do is just square down that shoulder line to meet that line there. So again, just use a square for that and a knife. Easy way to get this locating is get your knife in that shoulder line right on the corner there. It'll sort of locate in there, slide your square up to it, and then just drag down. So as you can see, again, using the stock against the face side here, and again this way. So instead of going from this side, because that's not my face side is facing me now. So I'm going to get the knife on the corner here, slide the square up, and then drag back. There we go. So that's all squared off all the way around. I can see clearly what material I want to remove. I'm going to do exactly the same on here. Light scores to start with, and there we go. Right, so both of those are marked out now. I can see which material I want to remove. I'm just going to scribble on the sides here what waste I need to remove. Oh no, the Jesus pen's running out. What am I going to do? So there we go. That's the marking out done. Be very careful and precise with it. There is no point trying to work accurately to those lines if they're not accurate in the first place. So next thing we're going to do is start sawing these out. I get to do some work. Right, to the vise. If you've watched other videos on cutting lap joints, some people will recommend you cutting straight to that line, and that should be your finished surface. I don't like to do that. I like to do the cleanup at the end with either a chisel or a shoulder plane. And the reason I do this is, one, because I will openly admit that I have off days with sawing. Sometimes it will go one way, sometimes it will go the other. Sometimes I'll get it spot on. If I'm doing actual work, I don't want to risk having one of those off days where everything goes to pot and I end up ruining my work. So I like to use a saw here to get rid of the bulk of the material, get it as close as I dare to that line, and then do the final cleanup. The second reason I finish it off with a chisel, which is slightly more justified, is because it gives you a more crisp edge on the corners here. Whereas with a saw, it's slightly fluffy. It works well in some cases with dovetails and stuff, for example, when you leave it straight off the saw, because that fluffy edge can sometimes fill some gaps and things like that. It has small advantages, but for something like this, I find it to be much more accurate and cleaner with a chisel. So let's get sawing this to start with. So before I start doing anything, usually what I will do is tilt the saw. I will tilt the workpiece 45 degrees like that. And then I can focus on cutting to this line here and this line that I'm seeing now. If I had it upright like this, it would mean that I could obviously see this line here and that line there, but I'm also hitting this one here, and I can't see that. So as I said in my video, how to use a saw correctly, I would focus on as few faces as possible just to eliminate the risk of something going wrong. So here, the minimum amount of faces we can focus on is 2. So all I'm going to do is just get it on the corner here, start with a push cut. Now, if you haven't already, be sure to watch my video on how to saw correctly. I'll put the link up here for it. It will be incredibly helpful for you when you're doing this. So here we go, just going to work down that. Just keeping an eye on all my lines on there. I'm just going to keep going until I hit the baseline on this side that's facing me. There we go, that's close enough. And now I'll flip it around and start from this side. So doing exactly the same thing. So there we go, starting on the corner and working down. So again, just let it creep up on that shoulder line at the bottom there. There we go. And obviously that has put a small peak in the middle now because we've only been cutting 45 degrees. So now saw in the middle and just straight down. And that's going to track those lines. Doesn't matter about this back edge here because I know it's following the path of least resistance. There we go. Right, we need to cross-cut this material off to give us our lap joint. So let's show you a few techniques for this. So what you may have heard of before is the concept of cutting a V-groove, and you do this with a chisel by simply putting it in like that, wiggling it and taking out a chip. I already done one, but I forgot to turn the camera on when I did it, so anyway, so they would do this all the way along and create a small V-groove, and this would create obviously a sloped surface like that, then that would meet up against the 90 degrees of the shoulder here. And then what they would do is get the cross-cut saw, put it in that V-groove, and it would slide up against their shoulder line there, and they would cut straight through. And for the same reasons before, I don't do this because, again, I have off days where I might over tilt the saw and undercut this shoulder and show a horrible gap on the inside here, or I might under tilt it. Yeah, let's say under tilt, and I'd have to clean it up with a chisel anyway. So I like to leave it about 0.5 millimeter away from that shoulder line. It's going to be difficult now because I've just chopped it away with a V-groove, but let's show you how I do that. So you may have seen all the saw marks in my shooting board here, and that's because I also use it as a bench hook. I'm going to make a new shooting board anyway because this one's annoying me now. I don't really like it, so I'm going to chop it up as much as I want. So what I'm going to do here, start about 1 millimeter away from the line. Again, I explain most of this in my video how to saw correctly, so same rules will apply here. Start on the back edge and then just slightly level out that saw. And obviously I did check that I was cutting on the waist side here. Don't accidentally cut on this side here. So there we go, level it out. And as you're approaching the bottom, just be careful you're not tilting the saw up and taking a massive chunk out the bit we want to keep. So keep it perfectly level. Check the back end momentarily. Make sure you're not going too deep. The saw kind of makes a different sound as it's approaching the bottom. There we go. So I just sort of bent it off then, and there we go. There is the first part of our lap joint. So I'm going to do exactly what we did here with the ash, and then we'll look at chiseling it down. And there we go, so interlude over, they're both cut out, and we can see that if we lap those together roughly, we've got face side on top, face side out, face side on top, face side out. Happy days. So let's start cleaning it up now. So we're going to need a chisel. First thing, get these sharp. If you haven't seen my video on how to get a deadly sharp edge on a chisel, go back and watch that, because for all of these videos, I'm assuming that you're working with sharp tools. If you're not, if you're working with a shovel, for example, you're not going to get the same results as we do here. So first thing I'm going to do here is clean up the shoulder line. But here's another important thing. The shoulder line is facing away from me like that. If I have it facing towards me like this, and I put the chisel into that knife line, I can't see if that chisel is facing towards you or towards me. So I don't know if that's cut square. If you turn it away from you like that, so it's in line with your eyesight, that means that I can see if that chisel is going in there square or not. Your eye is naturally good at seeing square. If it's not, get a square, put it up against the edge of your chisel, and there you go. You know that you're hitting that down square. So now let's get in even closer and you can see exactly what I'm looking at here. So as you can see, we have got the shoulder line here, we've got the cut line which is about 1 millimeter away, and this is where I cut that V groove. Going to struggle with that, but we'll use this bit here for reference purposes. So instead of going straight into that shoulder line there and whacking it through with a hammer, what that has the potential to do is, because of the shape of this chisel, it's going to want to push the chisel back into the shoulder line like that, and therefore it's going to damage this nice crisp edge that we've got. So generally the rule I tell people here is keep halving that material until you can't halve it anymore. So in the case of this, we've got 1 millimeter left. I'm going to take about half that off, so 0.5 millimeter, get that chisel square, and then just tap it through with a hammer. And there we go. I don't know if you saw it, but that actually did start compressing the chisel back a little bit like that. So that's exactly why I took away half the material first. So I'm going to do this all the way along. I'm not going to take it down to that final shoulder line just yet. And now with it all taken back, I can take it down to the final shoulder line. The reason I do it all in one pass like that, as opposed to doing half it and then down to the shoulder line, is because if this side of the chisel accidentally went into one of the parts that I hadn't chopped down yet, it's going to easily remove the bit of material that I have halved, but then if there's more resistance this end, it's going to twist the chisel into that shoulder line, so not ideal. Work all the way along first and then do the final chop all in one. So get the chisel 90 degrees. You can see here what a difference a sharp chisel makes. It just stays in the cut. And then just get these out like that. Don't be tempted to get them out like that, because if you slip, it's going straight into your hand, unless you clamp it down, of course, but just work yourself across like that. Clean out all that stuff in the corner, and then just check your work there. So it looks pretty good. I might have to do a little bit of final clear up, but first thing is I'll get this down to the thickness that's required. So I've now got the component clamped solidly in my wagon vise. You can do this in your quick release vise, or you could cramp it on top like this. Just make sure to put 2 there so it doesn't start pivoting. But all I'm going to do here is find that marking gauge line that I've squared around the top, and then just pop my chisel into it and push. So don't go willy-nilly here and push all the way through. Just establish it to start with. The reason for this is if I push that all the way through, it's going to rip this entire bit up and then it might follow the grain and go below the marking line there. So just establish it first, get it so it's cutting off cleanly, and especially on the end here, just roll that chisel round the corner. There we go. So now that is safely detached. I can give it a little bit more welly. Just working across like that. There we go. So just keeping the chisel flat, just slowly remove that off. Now again, be careful when you reach the ends here, because if it starts tracking the grain, it's going to fall below that line. So I'm just going to work to the middle here. Get rid of most of the peaks. I'm still working quite rough here at the moment. I'm not trying to get this down to my finished line. And now I'm going to flip this over and we're going to come from the other side here. So again, chisel in that mark. So start pushing that through. Be careful here because it might also split below here. So I'm just going to sever that off there as well. There we go. So it's all safely detached. Go. Now I'll just push this through. There we go, just pushing down on top of the chisel here. That's going to remove most of the high points. So here you go, it's starting to cut now. You can use that just to skim over the surface. It's going to get rid of most of those points. So the only bit now is we just got to attack the end grain here, so let's spin that round again. So now working in from the end grain. I had a slightly off day with my saw, so thank God I didn't cut to that line. I managed to stop it just before it hit that line, so that is all good. So here I'm just going to pop the chisel in that line that I can see there, push it through. And a lot of this you've got to do by feel because it's very hard to see that line sometimes. Got a bit on the corner there to get rid of. I'm just going to take one last skim along the top here, just to make sure there's no little peaks left, and take it down to that final marking gauge line. There we go. So that looks pretty good along the top edge there. Now, like I said, that's kind of the rough work with the chisel, just establishing all those edges. What you don't know at the moment is if you've got a little hump in the middle there, that when you put the other half of this joint on, it's going to rock all over. So if you're continuing with a chisel, on with a chisel by this point, what you want to do is get yourself a little ruler and just measure all the way along like that. And if you see any high points, get your Jesus pen and mark that high point, and then get your chisel and just hack that out. Just be careful not to touch any of these lines that you've established around the edge, because that's what you're going to see at the end of the day. In theory, this bit in the middle, you can slightly undercut it. And what I mean by undercut is make it lower than these marking lines here. So sort of dig in a little bit like this. That face, you're never going to see it, so you're never going to see that undercut, obviously. But obviously the trade-off with that is that you don't get as good of a gluing surface in the middle there. So ideally, keep it as flat as possible with these lap joints. So now I'm going to show you two methods you can use to flatten these off. First one is with a shoulder plane, and second one is with a router plane. So with joints like this is where a shoulder plane is really good, because instead of having to chisel that shoulder line there, I could just get the shoulder plane in there and trim it back like that, and that will give me a perfectly flat and a perfectly square edge. But I've shown you how to chisel that back, so that doesn't really matter. We're just going to use the shoulder plane to clean up this face here. So if you've watched my video on what to watch out for when setting up a shoulder plane, you'll know how I've set this up. So if you haven't already, go and watch that, but I'm just going to attack this now, and the shoulder plane is going to reference off all those high points, and it's going to take them off, leaving me with a perfectly flat surface here that's going to be really nice to glue to. So just take that through. There we go, that's taking a peak out the middle. And with this, just be careful that you're not accidentally hitting either side of that, because obviously that's the mark that you've chiseled to. So with a really fine cut, I can just hold it with my hand like this. If not, grab yourself a shooting board, and there you go, you've got a back edge to work to. So I'm just taking those little humps out the middle. And I was able to get this pretty close with a chisel. It's just the odd bit here and there that's needing to come out. So you can see how much more precise this is compared to using a chisel for it. Even though you could use a chisel, something like this is just going to give you a much better joint on it. There we go, that's looking pretty good. I'm just going to get the ruler on it now and just check it all the way along, because what has the potential here is where you've chiseled in, those edges might slightly dip off as opposed to the middle here, so you're just going to need to take a few more passes in that area. So as expected, I could see that this end closest to me was dropping off slightly from the chisel, so I've now got that facing me, and it's a bit easier to hit it with the shoulder plane that way. So there you go, let's hit it straight away. So coming in from the opposite face does help here as well. And if you want to know why I'm using this shoulder plane in particular, this is a Veritas one. I did a tool duel between the Veritas shoulder plane and the Lie-Nielsen shoulder plane, so the link's up here for that. And that will give you some pointers about what to consider when it comes to buying shoulder planes. So I think we're pretty much there with that now. Let's do one last check. It's looking pretty good. Just got one little bit on the opposite face that I want to get rid of, like that there. And I think that was it. So I made those marking lines as accurate as possible. Therefore, I'm going to work my way down to them as accurately as possible, and that will give me the best joint possible. So be really, really precise about this, really, really careful. Make sure that this face is perfectly flat and it isn't dropping off on any of the edges. I'm really happy with that. So now let's look at how to clean one of these up with a router plane. So this piece of timber has been prepared exactly the same as this bit here. So I went all the way around with a chisel on all three sides and then just lightly skimmed over the top of it to get it mostly there. So obviously with that, the same rules apply. We may still have a peak in the middle of this. So a router plane, where it's slightly different over a shoulder plane, is that instead of just planing all the way through there, we're going to reference off this top surface here. So I can put it on like that, and you can see how this is going to work. I can just tilt that through, and that's going to remove all the high points using this as the reference. There's a dog outside. So what I'm going to do is unlock the depth stop on this and start bringing the blade down from underneath. Now, while I'm winding this down, I did a tool duel on this router plane as well against the Lie-Nielsen one. So the one I've got here is a Veritas. So if you want to know why I'm using this one instead of the Lie-Nielsen, be sure to watch that. Link is around here for it. So that's mostly there now, and what I'm going to do is just get that resting on a point in the middle of this face, lock it down, and then we're just going to start pivoting it through. So because it was resting on a peak on the middle, it's just taking out any other points in there that are sort of the same height. Be careful as you reach this edge here because you can accidentally tip the router plane. What you can do is get a bit of material the same height as this bit, and that will just allow you to balance it a bit easier. So taking off those high points. So this is a little bit easier than the shoulder plane in that the tool's pretty much doing it all for you. You don't have to focus on where you need to move the material because this is doing it all at an equal rate. The only thing you have got to look out for on this is sometimes I find with router planes, they kind of dig in certain areas more than others. And I guess that's because you haven't got a bed directly around the blade supporting it to stop it from diving in. So just be careful of this. You want to take off very small amounts at a time, especially when you're approaching these edges that I'm doing around here. So that's pretty much all come down to a equal depth now. So there we go, let's see where we're at. So get the old ruler on there. Looking at that, I reckon it's dipping off not even 0.5 millimetre off the edges here where I chiseled it. So I'm going to bring that down a little bit more with the router plane just to take it down to that final bit there. And usually an adjustment this small, I can pretty much unlock and lock again, and that will lower it a very slight amount. I don't know if this is the case with other router planes as well, but I find this with the Veritas one. Again, if you watch the tool duel, I said that it feels a little bit sort of loose, and that's one of the factors of it. The fact that I can loosen that and then lock it off without changing anything else, and it drops the blade. I don't know, it's just a little bit fishy to me, to be honest. So I'm just going to come in from the opposite side as well. Just make sure I'm not blowing out that back edge. Get support when I'm reaching out further here. There we go. That is pretty much all an equal depth all the way along. So getting these assembled now. It's looking pretty good. The only thing I can see is that we have got a small shadow gap along here, which I'm not happy with. I'm going to try and get rid of that. And also on this edge here, that's where the corner came off of the panel saw, so let me off for that one. But we also have a very small gap along this shoulder line here. And what I reckon that is where this shoulder line here is slightly tipped away like this. So it means that it's touching the bottom before it's touching the top here and therefore creating a gap. So firstly, let's cut that shoulder line back and just sort that out. So with it upright in the vise like that, sharp chisel, I'm just going to come in and slightly take down that inside mark. In fact, there you go, I can see the small step there, so that's what's creating it. There we go. So all the way along. So the stage we're on now is the really fine tuning stuff. Everything up until this point has been coarse and medium. This is what I class as the fine stuff, where we're just doing those final tweaks, taking away the most stupid amount of material in order to make that joint close properly and look nice and pristine at the end. So getting rid of all that fluff there now, you could also get a knife in there perhaps and just help remove it all. We can just test this while it's in the vise like that. There we go. So that is closed beautifully on the bottom now. So that's what it was. It was just that shoulder line was sloping up a little bit and stopping it from seating properly. So now the shoulder lines on this joint are looking beautiful. It's just this one little bit here that I'm not happy with. And I reckon that is probably on the ash here, where, like I said before, with the chisel, where I've come in from this edge here, I think that that's slightly dropping away a bit. So the material is touching sort of in this area here, but this area is dropping off and therefore creating that gap. So if I get a ruler on that, let's see. Yeah, it looks to be the case. Can you see that tiny, tiny little bit there where the sort of shadow is sloping off? That's what's creating that gap. So we're going to get rid of that now, and we'll just do that with the router plane again. It's hardly any material whatsoever, but that is what is causing that shadow gap. I'm just going to do a quick skim all over again, just to make sure we haven't missed anything else. Right, so let's test it now. Much better. So you can see here, that will all close up with just the pressure of my fingers, and this is how I aim to get all of my joints that I cut. If you can close them with just the pressure of your fingers, that means that a clamp is going to completely close that up. So I'm really happy with that. Let's get it glued up and see how it cleans up. And there we go. That is how you cut the corner halving joint. So what we've got in here is nice crisp lines all the way around, a nice accurate shoulder line, and it is perfectly square. I don't have a square here, so I can't test that, but take my word for it, it is square. So yeah, that's how you do that one. The next one we'll be cutting is a T-halving joint. Very similar, but obviously with a few small differences, and that will be in the next video. Hope you enjoyed. See you next time.